Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and a couple of weeks ago I made a post on my Patreon page for my patrons asking them to ask me questions, and then now I've got about 13 questions, so I decided to make a video as I had promised here to answer these publicly. The reason for this, well, a few reasons. But number one is to thank people directly who support the show. Secondly is because, of course, I get a lot of questions, and sometimes I do answer questions that I find on my actual comment section here on YouTube, but I get about 20 to 22,000 messages every couple of months. So you understand how it's not physically possible for me to answer all questions. So at least choosing a few random questions from YouTube and then all the questions from Patreon, I decided to create an interesting video, and that is reason number 3 this video exists. It's to use your questions as a way to ignite spontaneous and interesting discussion and conversation. Let's get right to it. Question number 1 from Matthew Snook. He asks, what's your favorite period of Italian history that isn't Rome, Republic, Empire, etc., or the Renaissance? And that's a pretty easy question for me to answer. It would be the late 15th century. So we are sort of in between late medieval period and almost getting to the Renaissance. And the reason why I like it, there are lots of reasons. Reason number 1, it's 1485 is really the peak of full plate armor, in my opinion. Most beautiful harnesses that were ever produced were produced in Milan, northern Italy, around that period, already starting in the 1460s all the way up to 1485, 1490s is my favorite ever kind of personal body armor and protection. Secondly, my favorite painter ever, Raffaello Sanzio, was born in 1483, and we share the same name because, of course, on YouTube I'm known as the Metatron, but my actual name is Raffaello, just like the painter. The next question is from QUWYKXZ. And he asks, which period do you believe had the better swordsmen between Roman, medieval Italian or Renaissance Italian? And I mean swordsmen as a complete group, not individual people. Well, if you ask as a group, meaning an actual unit, I'm gonna have to go for Roman. But if we talk about duelists, so people who would be exceptional at one-on-one, then it would have to be probably Italian Renaissance. That's because Roman swordsmen were professionals and they were trained as a unit. So since you're talking about a group, I'm gonna say Romans. But if you take the most skilled Roman legionary and you put him against Fiore dei Liberi expert, then he would lose on a 1v1, and even more so against the Renaissance sort of duelists, because in the Renaissance you have they start using dual specialized weapons such as the rapier, for example, which in the hands of a skilled swordsman will give him an edge. Pun intended? Not intended? So that would be my answer. Jeffrey Monzigo asks, how many Romance languages are there in existence? National, regional, recognized and possible? Well, that is a huge question because unfortunately scholars of languages haven't really agreed. The reason being that some schools of thought put only national languages as such, and in that case the number is not going to be that big, because you've got like Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, and pretty much that's it. But it's the moment you start introducing dialects, then of course the situation changes completely. I mean, Sardinian is indeed a different language. It has a different grammar. It's even closer to Latin, but is it a dialect? Is it a language? Then it becomes more of a socio-linguistic question. Even Sicilian, which I do speak, is a dialect, completely different from standard Italian, and in some ways, grammatically speaking, closer to Latin. So again, is it a Romance language? Is it not a Romance language? I can't really give you a specific number because not even linguists have agreed on that. But since you mentioned possible, then probably there will be loads of possible languages. Also because in Italy, the moment you change region, you change completely. When you step into a completely different dialect, it will be like a different language, basically. So the only reason why we don't consider Sicilian or the dialect they speak in Lombardia, where Milan is, or the dialect they speak in Naples, as separate languages is because they don't have an army and a navy behind them. it's only political. But in terms of mutual intelligibility, then I know this is going to be strange for some people, but if you take a person who speaks standard Italian only, let's say someone from Tuscany, and they have to understand someone who speaks Spanish, so a different language, and I'm talking about Castilian, like Madrid Spanish, or someone who speaks Sicilian, chances are he will be able to gather and understand more from the person who speaks Spanish than the person who speaks Sicilian, even though Sicilian is a dialect of Italian and Spanish is a different language. Now that helps you understand that it is very weird, bizarre, this distinction we have between dialects and languages, and until this one is fixed, I can't really give you a number. Still, interesting food for thought. Andrew Salhani asks, any books you would recommend on everyday life of the Romans? Well, on everyday life, meaning what they ate and what they did, I can't really recommend a book, but I would recommend to just look for PhD thesis. That's what I usually use for my videos when I prepare them. I don't use Wikipedia. I usually use PhD thesis as a basis, then I study it, I rewrite a script, and I create a video. And that is because a PhD thesis is something that will be checked by peers and people, and, you know, professors and people who have PhDs on those subjects, and therefore it's more likely that it will contain good information. Whereas, of course, Wikipedia is written by anyone, so there will be a lot of problems, as I have shown on a video dedicated. I'll leave a link in the description below, together with a link to my Patreon if people want to join in with this interesting activity. Every time I get about 15 questions, I will make a video. 15 to 20, maybe 15 is enough. Also, before moving to the next question, if you are interested in learning Japanese, because I noticed a lot of you subscribers have mentioned, because you noticed that I made a couple of videos in Japanese, you noticed my fluency, and many people said, hey, I'm trying to learn Japanese, I don't know how to do it. How did you get so fluent? How could you understand Japanese so easily? And I'm considering making a video on the channel about it, but most of my language content is on Patreon, and on Patreon for the highest tiers I also offer one-on-one tutoring, and as you know, I'm a professional linguist, so you will find Japanese tutorials there and one-on-one tutoring. So if you're interested, check out my Patreon page. Jason Anderson speaks about slavery, and he says, how and when did slavery end in Europe? How much of the end of slavery is attributable, not sure if that's a word, to changing economic conditions and the fall of the empire, and how much to Christianity? Well, it's a big question, this one, because yes, I can give you actual official dates. I can give you 1833, I can give you 1865, I can give you, generally speaking, early to mid to late 19th century, sorry, depending on what country you're talking about. But with that being said, I understand that this may sound crazy, because you're like, hold on a minute, we are in the 21st century. You're saying that slavery was still a thing all the way up to the 19th century, and yes, it was. And the reason, are they economic? Yes, they are, but not in a way that you might think. So when talking about slavery, I might actually dedicate a video to this, but these official dates already are kind of weird, because the process that led to the release and end of slavery, which, as you know, he mentioned specifically Europe, but for example in America, it's what led to the Civil War. Oftentimes we romanticize it and we say, hey, the end of slavery is because finally the modern man is understanding that slavery is morally wrong, and therefore we decide to stop it. Well, that's very simplistic, and in fact this is a massive question, but I'd like to say there are economical reasons, there are political reasons, there is a specific inner propaganda, and of course, as a man of the 21st century, I consider slavery to be wrong, and I imagine that the majority of people watching here will agree with me. But in the 19th century, having a slave was absolutely fine. It was very Christian. The perspective was very different back in the day, and slavery has existed for almost as long as civilization has existed, so it's a very recent thing, the idea of slavery is wrong. We have lived with slavery, accepted it for many years, and when the British Empire, for example, abolished slavery, they did it also for personal gain reasons. A lot of taxpayers' money ended to compensate slave owners that were leaving slaves free, so they didn't really do it for moral reasons, they did it because they were making a profit out of it. So, you know, again, massive topic. Perhaps I'll re-see it. Thank you for the question. Here is a controversial one. Kevin McLean asks, I don't want to get you into any trouble, but what do you think about this new round of blackwashing? Now, with King Arthur the target, not to mention the attacking of monuments, including those of Roman emperors, Robert the Bruce, etc. I know you did a brave video on the topic before, yes I have. Things have gone downhill since then. Even. Yes, this is a very controversial topic. Am I going to be scared? Am I going to be like, oh no, politically correct stuff, I gotta be careful because if I say something and people get mad, they're gonna unsubscribe and they're gonna hate me. You know, I stand for the right every man has to have an opinion. Now, obviously, these opinions that people have a right to have need to be based on common ground. So if someone comes to me and says, it is my opinion that we should kill all people who have black hair and pedophilia is good, I'm going to say, well, I don't respect your opinion. In fact, I'm going to denounce you to the authorities. But as long as there is a common ground of understanding of basic human rights where the majority of people with common sense will agree with everything else, then I agree with liberty of speech. Oh, as you know, I've already spoken about blackwashing on my channel, and it's funny because that video lately has been getting a lot of comments and people have been calling me racist all the time. Am I going to remove the video? Absolutely not. In fact, I might even make another video about it. That's how I am. I face the tide. I don't care if the waves are coming against me or if the waves are going with me. My opinions don't change depending on what the masses think, because otherwise, getting linked back to how people thought in the 19th century, if I was a 19th century man, then I would have had to be like, oh yes, slavery is good because everyone thinks so. No, if I were a 19th century man, I would have probably stood up, I can't really know for sure, but knowing me, I would have probably stood up against slavery, and therefore as a 21st century man I stand against blackwashing as much as I stand against whitewashing, which is funny because it's exactly what people who call me racist are specifically choosing to ignore from my original video. So my original video on blackwashing history was a video where I was complaining about the fact that they were representing Roman soldiers as black, they were representing Achilles as black, they were representing Zeus as black, they wanted to represent King Arthur as black, as he's mentioning, they wanted to represent Julius Caesar as black, and all of this drives me nuts because we know they weren't black. On the other hand, on that same video, I also condemned whitewashing, which for some reason people just choose to ignore, and I said that if you're representing someone like Genghis Khan, you shouldn't use a white Caucasian actor. If you're representing a black African hero, you shouldn't use a white actor, etc. So I just fight for proper representation, particularly if we are dealing with history. And instead, unfortunately, political correctness and all of this situation that there is going on right now, I'm not racist and I fight just for right representation. In fact, on that video I said, if you want to create Netflix series with black African protagonists, I say set them in Africa. Tell me about African gods, African myths, African legends, African wars. There is so much rich history in Africa that you don't really need to come to take the Romans and paint them all black, which I find stupid just as much as it is stupid to take a Zulu warlord and paint him white. So what do I think of the new round of blackwash? Well, destroying monuments is wrong in my opinion, because monuments are there to remind us of history and as an artistic piece. Now, in terms of art, the statues of Octavianus Augustus, for example, are absolutely beautiful, so please don't touch them. As an artistic in heritage, it's absolutely beautiful. If you destroy all statues of every single person who has ever done something a specific political party doesn't like, then we will be left literally with nothing. I mean, think about the Crusades. Are we going to destroy all medieval cathedrals just because the Crusades were horrible? No, because we recognize the artistic heritage that they represent. And on the other hand, as I said, they also remind us of what happened. Just because something in history wasn't good doesn't mean that you have to completely erase the memory of it, because that's actually dangerous. So, are they going to destroy the statues of Roman emperors because they were violent and whatnot? They shouldn't, because if they do, then they are going to cancel, to erase the memory of it. And instead, I am a very strong supporter of teaching history as is, not changing it to facilitate a specific propaganda or political view. Teach history as is so that if there are good things in that thing we are studying, we may redo them and improve our civilizations and our living as human beings. And if there are horrible things that were done, let's study them so that we will not make the same mistakes. That's my opinion on that. Thank you for the question. Michael Cornier asks, have you ever read books in the LitRPG genre? And if so, what are your thoughts? I never have. I apologize profusely, but I don't have thoughts on it because I don't even know what they are. But since you mentioned them, I imagine they're important to you. I'll go check them out. Rui Inacio says, hi, this is a bit of a classical question. 1 versus 1 duel, no armor, no shield, any time period. Wow, that's pretty wide. Which sword do you pick? In your opinion, when do the Middle Ages begin and end? Okay, he's asking a few questions, so let's tackle the first one first. What sword would I pick? I would pick a rapier. Absolutely. I think if it's a duel, unarmored, I'm totally going for a rapier. I think it's the better sword, both for reach and hand protection and whatnot. In your opinion, when do the Middle Ages begin and end? Again, that's a difficult one because, as you know, there are a few schools of thought. Some people have the Middle Ages begin 1000 AD and end 1500 AD. I think with the end, we all agree. Although, again, depending on the country, some countries entered the Renaissance earlier than others. So there is that. And so other people instead have it's more of a more modern approach, has the medieval period begin in the 5th century, 6th century with the fall of Rome. Personally, it's just nomenclature. It doesn't really matter. I mean, you want to call them the Dark Ages, you want to call it the late antiquity, do you want to call it early medieval period? Doesn't really matter to me. I do like the early medieval, high Middle Ages, late Middle Ages definition and nomenclature. As long as it's easy to use, I don't mind using it. It's just like one of those situations where some people tell me that I shouldn't say BC AD, so before Christ, Anno Domini after Christ. They say that now it is more politically correct to say Common Era before Common Era. I don't care, but I'm still gonna use Anno Domini, I'm still gonna use BC because that's what I'm used to, that's what we've always used, and it works, it's functional, and again, it's cultural. So am I going to erase it just because it offends people? No, I like it. If you use Common Era, I'm fine with it. I don't get offended, so I don't think you should get offended if I use BC AD, and if you do get offended, not my problem. Jonathan Kyle Brooks asks, may we talk about the Japanese medieval European reenactors? They exist, but information is very scarce. Yes, I've seen them in Japan, although usually as reenactors, I mean, I've never been to a reenactor convention of people who do Japanese reenactment. I've mostly seen it during special occasions, events. They do that in Japan. They do have like, public holidays, bank holidays that represent, I don't know, sometimes they're very ancient as well, like for example the propitiatory dances to encourage the spirits of nature to give rain for your harvest and whatnot. I think that in crops, to increase production, all of that, they still do it. Most Japanese don't believe it, but they still do it as a cultural heritage. And when they do so, I have seen people, of course, wearing kimono, wearing yukata, and some people wear samurai armor if it's one of those specific events. I really like those events where they recreate battles. Absolutely beautiful. And I think I did make some footage when I was in Japan because I did take part. It was like one of those Sengoku Jidai period reenactment, and they did use Tanegashima Teppo and they shot with it. It was absolutely fantastic. Of course, it was with blanks, not with real bullets, but it still was, seeing gunpowder in use and all the smoke. It gave you an interesting perspective on what would have been like to be on a battlefield in the Sengoku period. Absolutely fascinating stuff. So very cool, but that's all I know about it. Matteo Bruni C asks, when the Senate of the Republic passed a law, what physical support did they use to write it down, if they did, of course? And more generally, did they use paper for their letters, messages, or they sent it out on wax tablets like the one in the picture? He's talking about the picture that I posted on Patreon. Thanks for the chance. Well, not really paper. They didn't really have paper back in the day, but they did use lots of different mediums. As you say, wax tablets were used, although they were mostly used for everyday stuff. The ones with a backbone of wood, they were used by legionaries, for example, they did write down, of course, legal documents, but they mostly used papyrus for that. And remember, keep in mind that papyrus was the monopoly of the production of papyrus was in Egypt. Generally speaking, as soon as Egypt became a province, of course, the production of papyrus became a provincial matter for the Romans. So for very authoritative documents, they would use papyrus. Otherwise, for other things, they would use instead animal skin to create this sort of medium. It's called pergamena, so scrolls in English. And the difference, in fact, is interesting because I've had a chance, when I visited the Vatican secret archives, which I was granted access to when I was a university researcher, student actually. I remember that when you touch physically papyrus is interesting because, of course, it has an interesting fibrous feel to the touch, but it's the same both in front and back. Instead, when you touch a scroll, so something, a pergamena in Italian, something that was made with animal skin, the look is not very, very different. It is different, the color and everything, but not exceptionally different. But what the difference is the touch, because when you touch a scroll, the back usually is very, very smooth, whereas the front tends to be very rough. And the reason is that usually the front is what would be the actual outside of the skin, whereas the inside of the skin is what represents the back, and it tends to be very smooth. It would be the inside part of your skin. It's kind of gross if you think about it, but that's how it worked and that's what they used. Anthony Gigliotti asks me, how did you go about designing the alphabet characters for Sephira? And for those of you who don't know, I'll link in the description below a video made a few years ago where I developed my own code, and it's a very, very intricate and complicated code that is used to encrypt information. And I have launched a challenge asking people to try and decode it. I'll have to do it again, maybe giving more written paragraphs to see if people can decode it. But the way I invented it is I tried to design, most of the symbols are just coming out of my mind, but I tried to design it in a way that each letter would fuse with the next letter in order for make it harder for people to understand when a letter begins and when a letter ends. And they're all designed that way. And that's why it took me quite a bit of time to create it, because I had to make sure that every single piece would connect with the other no matter what letter would come after. So that's the idea. Still, you can still figure out, of course, but it makes it harder. And then, of course, there are a few levels of and it was inspired on angelic tradition as well. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but perhaps I will make another dedicated video. Thank you. And we've got one last question. Elliot Childress, hello, I currently live in Japan and I've been browsing used samurai armor auction sites and I've seen many examples having leather strips on top of the door, but I haven't seen that in many reproductions for sale. Can you talk about it? I bought what I can only assume is either a real one or an old reproduction, and it has leather part, but it's only a covering on top of the metal. On real example, was it just a covering for decoration, or was it fully leather to allow better mobility? No, it was used, it was done. Not all samurai armor was, of course, leather covered, but some were. It was something that you could choose in some periods. And again, when you create armor in Japan, you can use loads of different possible materials. You can use leather as its sole material, but you can also use leather as a covering on top of the metal. And you can also use paper, which, I mean, it wasn't really used by the samurai, but it was used by the Ashigaru and lower factions. And you can use lots of different materials, and you can use steel, of course, depending on what how much money you have. So yes, it's authentic. I personally not a huge fan of leather covered metal, but it was used possibly to give an extra level, an extra layer. It might also help perhaps with the friction of weapons, and of course it could be done as well for decorative purposes. Okay, noble one, so these are the questions for today that I wanted to address. Make sure to come and join me on Patreon if you want to, both for Japanese tutorials, but also to join in. You just need to be a member of the lowest tier to join in to these Q&A, and then as soon as I gather again 15 to 20 questions, I will make another dedicated video here on YouTube. So it is a way to interact, discuss and talk. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon on my next video here on the Metatron channel. If you're not yet members of this community, become a noble one and subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.